In 1937, in the 8th year of the Great Depression, a book appeared with a title that must have sounded almost like a taunt to anyone standing in a breadline. Think and Grow Rich. Not work and grow rich. Not save, or invent, or inherit, or get lucky and grow rich. Think. As if the whole machinery of poverty could be dismantled from inside a person's skull. The book sold. It kept selling. It has now been in continuous print for nearly 90 years, and it sits underneath an enormous amount of what we today call the self-help industry, the motivational speaking circuit, the morning routine, the vision board, the affirmation, the mindset coach. If you have ever heard someone say that whatever the mind can conceive and believe, it can achieve, you have heard Napoleon Hill, whether or not the person saying it knew the source. If you have ever been told to write your goal down on paper with a specific number and a specific date and read it aloud twice a day, you have been handed a piece of this book. If you have ever heard the phrase mastermind group, that is this book too. And here's what makes it genuinely strange and worth spending an hour with, even now. Think and Grow Rich is a book about wealth that contains almost no financial advice. There is no chapter on compound interest, no discussion of margins, no market analysis, no accounting. Hill's claim is that money is downstream of something else entirely, and that the something else is a state of mind that can be deliberately manufactured. The book is, in that sense, less a business manual than a piece of applied psychology, written before most of the psychology existed, by a man whose own life story turns out to be considerably less reliable than he wanted you to believe. So we are going to do two things at once here. We are going to take the book seriously, because parts of it are startlingly good and have been quietly vindicated by later research. And we are going to keep our eyes open, because parts of it are nonsense, and one part of it is actively dangerous, and the man behind it left a paper trail that complicates everything. That double vision, admiration, and suspicion held at the same time, is the only honest way to read this book. Napoleon Hill presented himself as a man on a mission he had been handed by a giant. The story he told, over and over, was that as a young reporter he interviewed Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate turned philanthropist, and that Carnegie challenged him to spend 20 years interviewing the most successful people in America and to distill from them a philosophy of achievement that could be taught to anyone. No salary. Just an introduction to the great men of the age and the chance to do something permanent. It is a wonderful origin story. It gives the book an authority it could not otherwise claim, because it makes Hill not an author but a scribe, a man merely transcribing the operating principles of people who had actually done it. It is also a story that historians have looked at closely and doubted. The documentation that would confirm a Carnegie Commission of this kind is not there in the form you would expect it to be. That does not prove Hill invented it wholesale, but it does mean the foundation stone of the book's credibility is, at minimum, unverified, and that the most load-bearing claim in the entire enterprise, the claim that these principles were empirically extracted from hundreds of self-made fortunes, rests on an author's own testimony about himself. The circumstances of the writing are messier still, and they matter, because this is a book about character. In 1935, Hill's second wife, Florence, divorced him. In 1936, he met a woman named Rosa Lee Beeland at one of his lectures. He proposed the following day. They married quickly. They could not afford a home of their own, so they moved in with Hill's son Blair in New York City. Within a few months, Blair's wife, Vera, left the household because of Hill's harassment and abuse of her. Blair left shortly after. Before he went, he lent his father and Rosa $300 so they could finish the book they were working on. That book was Think and Grow Rich. The loan was reportedly never repaid, and Rosa is said to have taunted Blair about it. Note that phrase, the book they were working on. Rosa Lee Beeland contributed substantially to the authoring and editing of Think and Grow Rich. She is not a secretary in this story. When Hill and Beeland divorced in 1940, she kept the royalties, because the royalties had been placed in her name in the first place, specifically to shield them from claims by Florence and her children. So the most famous book about the power of the individual mind to generate wealth was co-produced by a woman whose name most readers have never heard, financed by a loan from a son who was driven out of his own apartment, and structured to keep the money away from the author's previous family. The intellectual lineage is more straightforward. Think and Grow Rich is a condensation of Hill's earlier and much longer work, The Law of Success, which laid out something like 16 laws. The new book compresses that material into a tighter framework it calls a philosophy of achievement, organized as 13 steps to riches. Compression is what made it a phenomenon. The Law of Success is a set of volumes. Think and Grow Rich is a book you can finish in a weekend and quote for the rest of your life. And it landed at exactly the right moment. 1937 was a year when the ordinary explanations for poverty were visibly failing. Millions of people who had worked hard and behaved prudently were ruined anyway, by forces they could not see and could not fight. Into that despair, Hill offered a proposition of extraordinary emotional power. The external world is not in charge of you. Your circumstances are the output of your thinking, and your thinking is the one thing no bank and no market and no government can foreclose on. Whether that is true is the question the rest of this book, and the rest of this discussion, is about. But you can understand why a person in 1937 would want it to be true so badly that they would pay for the privilege of hearing it said. The premise underneath all 13 steps is stated in the opening pages and never really argued for. Thoughts are things, and thoughts mixed with definiteness of purpose, persistence, and burning desire translate themselves into material equivalents. You have to be careful here, because this single sentence contains two very different claims that Hill deliberately blurs together, and almost every fight about this book comes from the blurring. The first claim is psychological and modest. It says that what you habitually pay attention to shapes what you notice, what you attempt, how you interpret setbacks, and how long you keep going. A person who has decided, concretely, that they intend to build something will spot opportunities that a person without that intention walks past. They will strike up different conversations. They will read differently. They will take a rejection as data rather than as a verdict. Over years, that difference compounds into different outcomes. This claim is not mystical at all. It is close to what modern research on goal setting, self-efficacy, and selective attention actually shows. The second claim is metaphysical and immodest. It says that thought is a causal force in the physical universe, that a sufficiently charged desire radiates outward and pulls its object toward you through some medium Hill never specifies. This is the claim that later mutated into the law of attraction and the whole vision board genre. There is no evidence for it. And it is not harmless, because its logical converse is brutal. If your thoughts create your reality, then your poverty, your illness, and your misfortune are your own doing. Hill never quite says that outright, but the book leans on it constantly, and generations of readers have drawn the inference. Reading well, then, means separating these. Take the first claim, which is defensible and useful. Leave the second, which is not. Most of the practical apparatus in the book survives that surgery intact, and it is worth noticing that Hill's own instructions are almost always behavioral. He tells you to write things down, to say them out loud, to build a plan, to assemble a group, to keep going. Those are actions. The metaphysics is the wrapper. The exercises are the product. The first step is desire, and Hill is emphatic that he does not mean wishing. He distinguishes between a wish, which is a pleasant fantasy that costs nothing, and a burning desire, which is a decision that has been made so completely that retreat is no longer an option. The story he uses to illustrate this is the one about Edwin Barnes, a young man who decided he would not merely work for Thomas Edison, but would be Edison's business partner. He had no money, no credentials, and no introduction. He arrived at Edison's laboratory looking like a tramp, asked for a job, took the lowest one available, and waited years in obscurity until the moment came when he could make himself indispensable, which he did by selling a machine that Edison's own salesman thought was unsellable. And he became a partner. The moral Hill draws is not just persistence. It is that Barnes had a definite objective, not a general ambition. He did not want to succeed. He wanted one specific thing, and the specificity is what let him recognize his opening when it finally appeared. This is the strongest practical idea in the book, and it deserves to be stated plainly. Vague goals do not organize behavior. Specific goals do. Hill turns this into a concrete exercise that is still the most quoted thing he ever wrote. Decide on the exact amount of money you intend to acquire, not a range and not a lot. Decide exactly what you intend to give in return for it, because he insists there is no such thing as something for nothing. Set a definite date. Write out a plan and begin acting on it immediately, whether or not you feel ready. Then write all of this into a single clear statement and read it aloud twice a day, once at night and once in the morning, seeing and feeling yourself already in possession of it. Strip the mysticism from that, and you are left with something a modern behavioral scientist would recognize: a written, specific, time-bound commitment paired with an explicit exchange. Rehearse daily so that it stays at the front of attention rather than sinking to the bottom of a mental list. The requirement to name what you will give in return is the underrated part. It quietly converts a fantasy of receiving into a plan of producing, and it is the line that separates Hill's version from the pure wish and receive doctrine his imitators built later. The second and third steps, faith and autosuggestion, work as a pair, and together they contain the book's most interesting psychological move. Hill's problem is obvious. He has just told you to declare, with total conviction, that you will possess something you do not currently possess and have no visible means of obtaining. Most people cannot do that. They say the words and some interior voice says, "No, you won't. Who do you think you are?" Hill's answer is that faith is not a gift some people happen to have. It is a state of mind that can be induced, deliberately, by repetition. Tell yourself something often enough, with enough emotional charge behind it, and the subconscious will eventually accept it as fact and begin acting accordingly. This is autosuggestion, the conscious mind deliberately programming the unconscious one through repeated, emotionally loaded self-statement. Hill is explicit that repetition without feeling does nothing. Dead words produce nothing. The emotion is the carrier. Now, the mechanism he describes is dated, and the model of mind behind it is not how anyone would describe cognition today. But the underlying observation is not wrong. Belief about one's own capability is not fixed. It does influence performance, and it is partly responsive to deliberate practice. What we would now call self-efficacy predicts persistence, effort, and how people interpret failure. There is real evidence that how you talk to yourself matters, and that self-directed statements can shift effect and behavior, though the effects are more modest and more fragile than Hill's total confidence implies. Where he goes badly wrong is in treating belief as sufficient rather than necessary. Confidence uncoupled from competence is not an asset. It is a hazard, because it produces people who cannot hear correction, who mistake the intensity of their conviction for evidence, and who double down precisely when they should be revising. Hill's system has no error detection built into it. There is no chapter on how to tell the difference between a goal you should persist at and a goal you should abandon. In his framework, doubt is always the enemy, never the signal. That is the missing organ in this book, and it is missing in most of what descends from it. The version worth keeping is narrower and truer. Your assessment of what you are capable of is not a neutral reading of the facts. It was shaped by your history, it is frequently wrong in the pessimistic direction, and it can be revised by evidence you generate through action. Small kept promises to yourself do more for it than affirmations do. But affirmations said with feeling and then followed by the action they describe are not worthless either. The fourth step is specialized knowledge, and it contains one of Hill's sharpest and most contrarian arguments. General knowledge, he says, no matter how large the quantity, is of little use in the accumulation of money. Educated men are not necessarily wealthy, and wealthy men are frequently not educated in any formal sense. What matters is knowledge organized and directed toward a definite end. He goes further, and this is the part that still stings. You do not need to possess the knowledge yourself. You need access to it. He points out that a leader's job is to know where to find what is needed and how to organize people who have it, not to carry it all personally. The truly great achievers, in his telling, were assemblers of other people's expertise. That is a genuinely liberating reframe, and it holds up. Expertise is a market you can buy from, partner with, or hire. The bottleneck for most ambitious projects is not the founder's personal knowledge, but their willingness to go acquire, from someone else, the piece they lack. And Hill's corollary is equally durable. Education does not end at graduation, and the person who is not deliberately acquiring specialized knowledge relevant to their aim is standing still. The fifth step, imagination, is where the idea becomes the plan. Hill divides imagination into two kinds. Synthetic imagination rearranges existing concepts into new combinations, which is what most invention and most business actually consists of. Creative imagination is his term for the flashes that seem to arrive from outside, hunches and intuitions, which he attributes to a faculty that connects the individual mind to something larger. The first category is sound and useful. The second is where the book starts drifting toward the mystical, and you can take it as metaphor for the way solutions surface after a period of saturated, unconscious incubation, which is a real and well-documented phenomenon even if Hill's explanation of it is not. The practical instruction is good regardless. Ideas are worth nothing in the abstract. They acquire value only when they are given definite form, attached to a plan, and put into action. The world is full of people carrying around an idea they have never tested, protecting it from contact with reality because contact might disprove it. Hill's whole orientation is against that. Get it out of your head and into a form that can succeed or fail. Steps 6 through 8 are the engineering section of the book, and they're the ones the modern motivational industry tends to skip because they are the least glamorous. Organized planning is Hill's insistence that desire without a practical plan is just noise, and, crucially, that your first plan will probably fail. He says this directly and repeatedly. Expect the plan to be inadequate, and when it collapses, build another one, and if that one collapses, build another. Temporary defeat means only that the plan was unsound, not that the objective is unreachable. He is describing iteration, decades before anyone in business called it that. The persistence he demands is not persistence in a method. It is persistence in the aim, combined with ruthless willingness to discard the method. He also spends considerable space on how to be useful to other people, on leadership, on the difference between leading by consent and leading by force, and on the causes of failure in leadership, including disloyalty, refusal to do work one asks of others, and the fear of competition. This section is dated in its texture and unmistakably written for the working world of the 1930s, but the core observation is timeless. You will not build anything of scale alone. And your ability to get others to want to work with you is a skill you can study rather than a personality you either have or lack. Decision is the seventh step, and Hill's claim here is empirical and blunt. In his study of people who accumulated fortunes, the pattern was that they reached decisions quickly and changed them slowly, if at all, while people who failed reached decisions slowly and changed them often. He connects this to what he calls the habit of being influenced by the opinions of others, which he treats as one of the great destroyers of ambition. Everyone around you has an opinion about your plan. Most of them cost nothing to give, and if you sample enough of them, you will end up with no plan at all. There is a real insight buried in that, and it is not simply be stubborn. It is that decision-making authority has to be located somewhere, and if you have not consciously located it in yourself, it will default to whoever spoke to you most recently or most loudly. Hill's advice is to keep your own counsel while a plan is fragile, share it with the small number of people who are genuinely invested in your success, and stop soliciting general referendums on your life. Persistence, the eighth step, is where Hill is at his best because he refuses to treat it as a character trait. He treats it as a habit built from ingredients he lists: definiteness of purpose, desire, self-reliance, definite plans, accurate knowledge, cooperation, willpower, and habit itself. If you lack persistence, his diagnosis is that you lack one of those components, and the fix is to supply it rather than to berate yourself for weakness. The story he attaches to this is the one about the man who bought mining equipment, dug for gold, hid a vein, watched it disappear, drilled on for a while, gave up, and sold his machinery to a junk dealer for a few $100s. The junk dealer brought in an engineer who calculated that the vein resumed 3 feet from where the digging had stopped. 3 feet. The lesson Hill draws is that most people quit at the edge of the result, and that the distance between failure and success is frequently much shorter than it appears from inside the failure. It is a great story, and, like all such stories, it is selected after the fact. Nobody writes the parallel story about the man who dug 3 more feet and 30 more, and found nothing and lost everything. Hill has no answer for that man, because his framework does not permit that man to exist. Hold the lesson, which is that people systematically quit earlier than optimal, alongside the correction, which is that persistence needs a stopping rule, and the stopping rule should be written down in advance while you are still thinking clearly. The 9th step is the one with the longest afterlife, and possibly the most valuable idea in the entire book. Hill defines the mastermind as coordination of knowledge and effort in a spirit of harmony between two or more people for the attainment of a definite purpose. He argues that when minds work together in genuine alignment, something emerges that exceeds the sum of the participants, and that no one has ever accumulated a great fortune without the operation of such an alliance. He gives this a mystical gloss, describing a kind of third mind that comes into being between people. You can discard that framing and lose nothing, because the practical claim underneath is completely solid and has been demonstrated many times over. Your effective intelligence is not bounded by your own skull. It is a function of the group you are embedded in. A well-chosen group supplies knowledge you lack, catches errors you cannot see, applies social pressure toward follow-through, and, not trivially, sustains your morale through the long stretch where nothing is working. Hill emphasizes two conditions that people routinely ignore when they try to build one of these. The alliance must be in a spirit of perfect harmony, meaning that friction, competition, and hidden resentment destroy the effect. And it must be built around a definite purpose, not general fellowship. A group of ambitious people who meet to chat is a social club. A group of ambitious people organized around a shared, specific objective is something else. The modern descendant of this is everywhere. Founder peer groups, writing groups, accountability partnerships, board advisors, the entire practice people now call the mastermind group takes its name directly from this chapter. And the underlying advice, choose your close circle deliberately rather than by proximity and accident, is probably the single highest leverage instruction in the book. Most people assemble their social environment passively and then wonder why their ambitions keep eroding. Then there are the parts nobody puts on a motivational poster, and I want to describe them accurately rather than pretend the book is more sensible than it is. The 10th step is titled The Mystery of Sex Transmutation. Hill's argument is that sexual desire is the most powerful drive humans possess, and that this energy can be redirected, transmuted into creative and professional work. He claims that men of great achievement are highly sexed and that their accomplishment came from channeling that force rather than dissipating it, and he asserts, with no support, that most great achievers did not hit their stride until their 40s or later, because that is when they learned to redirect this energy. The chapter is written entirely about men, with women appearing mainly as sources of inspiration or distraction, and it reflects the sexual pseudoscience of its era. There is a small, ordinary truth trapped inside it, which is that drive is drive and that intense energy has to go somewhere. But the theory is not supported, and the framing has aged terribly. The 11th and 12th steps, the subconscious mind and the brain, are Hill's attempt at a mechanism. He describes the subconscious as a receiving station that accepts whatever is repeatedly transmitted to it, positive or negative, and acts on it without judgment, which is why he insists on guarding what you feed it. Then he describes the brain as both a broadcasting and a receiving station for thought, and he means this literally, drawing on the era's fascination with radio and with telepathy research. This is where the book leaves anything resembling science behind. Read as metaphor. The subconscious chapter still says something useful about habituated attention and the emotional coloring of a mental environment. Read as physics, it is simply wrong. The 13th step is the sixth sense, which Hill describes as the apex of the philosophy, a faculty of creative imagination that delivers hunches and inspirations, and that becomes available only after mastering the other 12 steps. He describes his own practice of holding imaginary council meetings with historical figures he admired, summoning them in his mind to advise him, and he tells the reader that these sessions became so vivid he was unsure whether they were purely imaginary. It is a genuinely odd passage. It is also, viewed charitably, a visualization technique, a way of interrogating a problem from perspectives other than your habitual one, and people still use versions of it deliberately today. The book closes with a section on fear, which Hill calls the 6 ghosts of fear: the fear of poverty, of criticism, of ill health, of the loss of love, of old age, and of death. He treats these as states of mind, inherited and absorbed rather than innate, and therefore as things that can be dissolved by decision. His treatment of indecision, doubt, and fear as a linked chain that feeds itself is sharp, and his observation that the fear of criticism is what stops most people from ever putting a plan into the world is, I think, simply correct. It is also here that his most useful behavioral advice appears in negative form. Much of what you call thinking is actually absorption of other people's anxiety, and you can decline to accept the transmission. An honest summary has to state the objections plainly, because they are not minor. The evidentiary base is unverifiable. Hill claims 2 decades of study of hundreds of successful people. There is no methodology, no data, no way to check any of it, and the origin story that authorizes the whole project is doubted by historians. What the book actually offers is a collection of vivid anecdotes selected because they illustrate a conclusion already reached. That is not research. That is rhetoric. The survivorship problem is total. Every story in the book is about someone who made it. The people who did all 13 steps with maximum intensity and still lost everything are absent, not because they do not exist, but because they do not sell books. Any framework built exclusively from winners will overstate the reliability of whatever the winners happen to do. The structural blindness is severe. There is essentially no acknowledgement in this book that capital, credit, timing, race, gender, health, family obligation, or luck have anything to do with outcomes. Written in the middle of the Great Depression, addressed to people ruined by a systemic collapse, it tells them the problem is their thinking. That is an extraordinary thing to say, and the reason it sold is precisely that it converted helplessness into agency. But agency purchased by denying real constraints is a loan against reality, and the interest comes due as self-blame. And the moral weight of the author's own conduct cannot be waved off in a book whose subject is character. The man teaching a philosophy of achievement was, in the very months of writing, driving his daughter-in-law out of the home with harassment, taking a loan from his son that was never repaid, and arranging the royalties to keep them from his previous family. He was, at that moment, telling millions of readers about harmony and definiteness of purpose and the rewards of rendering useful service. You can hold the ideas and still register that. None of that means the book is worthless. It means the book is a mixture, and the reader has to do the sorting that Hill did not. So what survives, and what should you actually do with it? Definiteness beats intensity. A specific objective, with a number and a date and a written statement of what you will give in exchange, organizes behavior in a way that general ambition never does. This is the book's strongest and most testable contribution, and it costs nothing to try. Belief is partly constructed, not merely discovered. What you tell yourself repeatedly, with feeling, shapes what you attempt and how long you last. Hill's mechanism is dated, but his instruction to deliberately manage your own self-talk rather than let it run on inherited default settings is sound. Pair it with evidence from small-kept promises, or it becomes hollow. You do not need to know everything, you need access. Specialized knowledge organized toward a definite end beats general erudition, and the knowledge can be bought, borrowed, or partnered with. The bottleneck is usually willingness to ask, not capability. Your first plan will fail, and that is information about the plan, not the goal. Iterate the method, hold the aim. This is the part of persistence that people misunderstand as stubbornness. Decide quickly, revise slowly, and stop taking a public vote on your life. Protect a fragile plan from casual opinion. Reserve real input for the small number of people who are actually invested in the outcome. Choose your circle on purpose. The mastermind principle is the highest leverage idea in the book. Assemble a small group around a definite shared purpose, keep it free of friction and competition, and you effectively expand what you are capable of thinking and sustaining. Fear of criticism kills more plans than failure does. Most people never put the thing into the world at all, and they experience that avoidance as prudence rather than as fear. Naming it correctly is most of the fight. And the meta takeaway. Read the book as a set of behavioral exercises wrapped in a metaphysical story. Keep the exercises and discard the story. Wherever Hill tells you to do something, take it seriously. Wherever he tells you how the universe works, do not. There is a version of Think and Grow Rich that deserves its reputation and a version that deserves its critics, and they are printed in the same volume, sometimes on the same page. The version that deserves its reputation is a manual for the psychological infrastructure of ambition. It says, be specific, write it down, decide what you will give in return, assemble people around you, expect your plan to fail and rebuild it, keep your own counsel, do not quit at the point where quitting feels most reasonable, and manage the voice in your head as carefully as you manage your calendar. There is nothing in that list a modern behavioral scientist would object to, and there is a great deal in it that most people never actually do. The version that deserves its critics is a doctrine that thought is a force acting on matter, that circumstances are always the output of the mind that endures them, and that anyone who has not grown rich has failed a test of belief. That doctrine flatters the fortunate and punishes the unlucky, and it has been the engine of an enormous amount of exploitative marketing in the 90 years since. What I find most useful about reading it now is the reminder of how thin the line is between those two versions, and how easy it is to slide from the first into the second without noticing. The disciplines of ambition are real and worth practicing. The story that those disciplines are sufficient, that the world owes an outcome to sufficient wanting, is a comforting fiction that will eventually cost you either your money or your self-respect. Hill's own life is the argument against his own book, in a way he could not have intended. Here was a man who applied every principle to himself with total conviction, who believed in definiteness of purpose and the transmuting power of desire, and who was, in the season of his greatest success, funded by a son he did not repay and married to a co-author whose name was left off the cover. He got the fortune. The philosophy of achievement did not produce the character it advertised. So take the exercises. Write the specific number and the specific date and the specific thing you will give in return. Find 3 people who genuinely want you to succeed and meet with them about something definite. Build the plan, watch it fail, build the next one. And keep, alongside all of it, the one instrument Hill left out entirely, the willingness to be told you are wrong, and to change your mind while there is still time.